first came out about the third season of the Owl House only being 3-hour-long specials, I was immediately both bummed out that the show was essentially getting cut short and worried that the third season would end up feeling somewhat rushed as a result. However, as I said in my video about the first 2 seasons from about a year ago, if any team could handle such a hurdle and still produce a quality ending, it was the team that had made the first 40 fantastic episodes. And now, with the finale airing last weekend, it's time to see whether my hope was misguided or if they truly nailed the ending to the show. In this video, I'm going to go through each of the 3 specials and then do some wrap up at the end about both the season and the legacy of the series as a whole.
These children are demon spawn and they want your teeth!
Thanks to Them opens just as King's Tide ended, with Luce and the gang arriving back at her house. The reunion scene between her and her mother is exactly what it should have been, and is the first of many successfully emotional scenes throughout this thing. The episode does cut away from it a bit earlier than I perhaps would have gone for, but I do really love the following scene with Luce and Hunter bonding over the secrets that they're holding from the others, and it's a nice continuation of their bond from Hollow Mind, something that plays pretty heavily throughout this first special. Before getting to that though, the first 7 or so minutes of this thing are made up of somewhat lighthearted shenanigans with the Boiling Isle natives interacting with the human world, most of which is shoved into a montage that I imagine would have been more spread out if the show had gotten the 20 episode season that it was expecting. Still, there's a lot to enjoy in this sequence, the first of which being that the show doesn't make the teens as shell-shocked as they would realistically be, as while they do perhaps go a little bit too hard in the other direction, it allows us to see the personality of the gang from the very beginning, which gives us a little bit more of the fun dynamics between the characters before the show's early end. The Hunter and Gus stuff throughout the episode is fun, especially with the knowledge that Gus knows about Hunter's secret and is trying to subtly get him to feel better about it. His obsession with human stuff coming to fruition and Amity and Willow teaming up to destroy an alarm clock are both nice moments to get before the montage, but the standout moment of the opening minutes is Luce and her mother finally having a moment alone where Luce apologizes. We get a pseudo version of this back in yesterday's Lie, and we won't get the fullest version of this until later in the episode, but it's nice to release the tension in front of the definitely not symbolic family photos, and it also fully establishes the theme of Luce's guilt regarding her friends being trapped. Anyway, it's after this scene that we get the big Sorry Season 3 is Short montage, which definitely has a lot to talk about, the first of which being Luce's coming out video, which while it is definitely a little bit on the nose, I get that it kinda has to be, it's still a nice moment that definitely deserved more time than this episode was able to give it. While a lot of this montage is just fun stuff, like everybody getting costumes and V getting a new form, a trend throughout this one is also, dang, it kinda sucks to be Hunter. Everybody pinning up pictures of their family while Hunter just stares is heart-wrenching, and this scene with him seeing Caleb in the mirror is one of my favorite shots in the entire show, as the crisis of Hunter's identity clearly establishes itself as a main issue of this episode. Willow cutting Hunter's hair is also a nice moment, but we're gonna have plenty of time to talk about those two with the next episode's review. The scene with everybody in the rain is as bittersweet can be, and it's a nice transition to the reveal that Luce is still going to school despite everything that's going on. Overall, while it's unfortunate that it was necessary, the montage is a really good tone setter for the episode, and I'm already 800 words into the script and not even 8 minutes into the episode, so let's go ahead and speed things up a little bit so the video ends one day. Everybody hanging out without Luce lets us see some dynamics that we never really got to see in the Luce-centric first 2 seasons, and the episode does a really good job pacing the reveal of Titan's blood throughout the 44 minutes in order to make it feel like both one cohesive episode and like an arc that could have made up multiple episodes in the best kind of way. It's nice to see Amity take charge for trying to be productive while Luce is at school, as besides this and her interactions with Luce, she's definitely the least explored character in this first special. Catching back up with the protagonist at her school, it's a bit too much of a dramatic scene for my liking to have her blurt out her regrets in the middle of English class, but the sentiment still creates a really interesting scene that further reveals the inner turmoil of her character, as well as simply showing that her time at Hexside did not help her become a more typical student. She gets invited to the haunted hayride hayride, which sets up the ending to this Halloween bash. And wait, I didn't even mention that this was a Halloween episode, which, considering the show's general atmosphere, I'm glad that they found a way to give it the Halloween special that it deserved, even if it's not as full-blown as it could have been. Back to the episode, the Cosmic Frontier stuff with Gus and Hunter is another opportunity for Gus to try to subtly get Hunter to bring up being a clone, and it segues well into Luce's mother's dream sequence, which is fantastically animated and adds another layer of depth to the character, which is kinda necessary given how big of a role she plays in this final season. So many cool animation choices here, and Camilla just trying to prevent her daughter from being bullied like her is a great layer of development to give the character, and it makes the next scene between them where they both apologize even more meaningful. Getting back to everybody else, watching them prance about the town has most of the humor in this episode, and the giraffe callback is just as funny as it was before. Masha coming back is a nice addition to the episode, and the solving of the map, while a bit slow, is more than sufficient to create the mystery vibe the episode was going for, and gives V the finding family moment that she was hunting. Next up is Hunter and Luce going after Melos, and I really like this scene too. Hunter by far has my favorite arc of the episode, and the suspense created in this scene really fits the horror part of this first special. Hunter crying under the mask is a heartbreaking scene right at the end, and it really demonstrates how the show has truly nailed the platonic relationship between Luce and Hunter, and it makes the end of this episode even more brutal. Anyway, if you could still see out your eyes after watching Hunter sob, the episode then sets up the climax of Luce deciding that she's at fault for everything, being that she's going to announce to her friends that she's not returning to the demon realm. This plotline makes a lot more sense when it comes back up again in the second episode, but here it doesn't really work super well. While I get that the point is that Luce is being irrational, it's hard for me to really comprehend how her not going back to try to fix the problem she created is her somehow redeeming herself for causing a day of unity in the first place. The episode presents it as her just being too hard on herself, but it's really more selfish than anything, especially given that she plans to just spring it on her friends before they even find a portal. For all she knows, the situation to get back to the demon realm is hopeless, so she's basically just telling them that she's not going to go back even when they don't even know if they're going to be able to either. Whatever though, she ends up never actually giving this speech, but before we get to that, let's talk about the haunted hayride, which gives the perfect excuse for everybody to switch into the costumes that they're going to wear for the rest of the season, which makes it feel more like a special, and also further establishes the link between everybody and the character they're dressing up as. Anyway, the gag with Jacob is the perfect way to bring back his character, short and sweet, and we get pretty quickly to Masha's ride through the story of the Widowbanes. The presentation during this presentation is just tremendously great, as the show explains the story that fans smarter than me had already somewhat pieced together, and it sets up the big death at the end of this episode. Hunter and Luce continue to bond as the non-witches of the group, as Hunter spills the beans regarding the Titan's blood and the pair go off to find it. And that's when this episode reaches its climax, both in its plot structure and in quality, as the blood-curdling depiction of Melos taking over Hunter's body is perfect, and the conversation between Melos and Luce is incredibly well written. The fight that follows is equally well choreographed too, as the Disney money comes into full effect for the first of many times throughout this season, and just the pure smoothness of the animation. I know that I've continued to describe Hunter's arc in this way, but there's truly no other way to describe Hunter trying to distance himself from his old life, only to be overtaken by Melos, as anything else but heartbreaking, as he desperately tries to stop Melos from ruining his friend's life just like he ruined his. But of course, the moment that you remember from this scene is Melos killing Flapjack, which immediately reveals the season's intentions that unless you're a teenager that Disney probably won't let die, you're not safe. While this doesn't really come to fruition in the other two specials, this tension that this moment creates leads to the rest of the episodes benefiting greatly. Anyway, back to this episode. The scars all across Hunter's body showing just how truly brutalized he was by the attack, followed by Flapjack using his last bit of energy to heal him, both make for such a tragic scene, especially when you remember how much Hunter resents Melos for using Palisade to stay alive, which is exactly what Hunter does here, albeit unconsciously. As I mentioned before, I'm glad that Camilla saves us from Luce having to give an entire speech about not going back to the demon realm just for everyone to tell her that she's dumb, and the decision to leave V back in the human world, while initially somewhat disappointing, ultimately helps in decluttering the rest of the season a little bit, as the next episode needs all the time it can get, and it kinda ends up being too full of characters by the end anyway. Ultimately, a lot of the of themes and character arcs that are mentioned in this episode are continued in the rest of the series, which, while it does cut this review short, just proves how effective it was as a first episode of the season. While obviously not a typical season premiere, being a third of the entire thing, the episode still does exactly what a season premiere should do: connect the last season finale to the new status quo, and set up the plot and character arcs for the next season, both of which this episode does, as well as just being entertaining in its own right. I could really talk about this episode for a little bit longer, but this video is probably already approaching 10 minutes long, so let's just go ahead and get to the next episode.
Has Thalamiel been your last name this whole time?
Just like Thanks to Them, For the Future starts from the ending of King's Tide, this time from the Boiling's Isles perspective. The way that the beginning of the Collector's Rule is animated immediately sets the tone for the environment and that the rest of the episode takes place in, as the aesthetics of the Collector and the Boiling Isles obviously clash in a really interesting way. Watching King be forced to take more of a protection role despite his lack of maturity is something else that's interesting in this episode, and I think it reflects really well on his arc that was started in season 2, as well as setting up a bigger character moment for him in the finale. The whole opening scene in general is filled with some great shots as Hootie and Lilith go puppet mode and Ida goes beast mode, as it sets up the feeling of disarray that Luce and the gang walk into after the title card. The tease of the Titan in the in-between realm does exactly what it's trying to do, set up yet another mystery for the finale to reveal, and as soon as the group sets foot in the demon realm, the threads for the character arcs of this episode began to reveal themselves. Unlike the last special, which largely focused on Luce and Hunter, this one focuses a bit more on its side cast, as Willow especially gets a pretty big focus from the beginning, which ultimately ends up being my favorite part of the episode, but we'll get to that later. On the way to and during the group's stay at the Owl House, I love the focus that the show gives on actually showing that Hunter is deservedly pretty messed up about the events of the last episode. Every other character kind of moves on a bit quickly, but I enjoy the attention given to Hunter's grief and self-hatred regarding Flapjack's fate. Camilla's presence in this episode to both act as Luce's pair while the other episodes developed elsewhere, as well as accelerate some of their arcs, works really well, and it definitely justifies taking a bit of attention away from some of the main characters, and we also get to see some of the humor from a human discovering the demon realm that hasn't been seen since the first couple of episodes. Back to Willow, starting from the very beginning of the episode, her arc is revealed to be her struggle to try and remain the emotional leader of the group, while also being the emotional wreck that everybody else is at the same time. It's a neat direction to take to try to give her character some depth for the episode, and the way that it bounces off Hunter's issues later is truly terrific. Finally in the house, before getting to see King and the Collector, we get a scene between Amity and Luce about her palisman. A scene like this was definitely necessary to have before it hatches later in the episode, and it's always nice to get to see some Luce and Amity, even if the latter continues to not get a ton of spotlight in this episode. Tying together Luce's inner turmoil along with why her palisman isn't hatching does a good job connecting the physical and thematic plot of the episode, which helps it feel like it's part of a big finale. Up next, we get two big reveals for the state of the world post Day of Unity, being first that King and the Collector have been using the puppets to recreate Luce's life, and two, that Hexside is being used as a safe haven for the kids, and is being ruled by Basha and two new characters who definitely don't resemble anybody else in the show's cast, who is mysteriously missing. Starting with the former, it's a good way to try to convey some stuff to the main cast that the audience already knows, and watching Willow try and grasp the shell of her father that's left is a really brutal scene that's somewhat skipped past. The animation during this one, just like the entirety of the season, does a fantastic job in bringing this childish hellscape to life, and the Collector works really well as a true chaotic neutral antagonist. Speaking of the Collector as a villain, I haven't mentioned him yet, so I'll talk about him here for a second. Broadly speaking, he's fantastic throughout this episode in showing just enough power to seem invincible, while also being weak enough that King can go off and do his little King shenanigans without it seeming like a plot hole. While he obviously doesn't have a ton of character development in this episode, most of that is saved for the first half of the finale, he fits the role of primary antagonist really well, especially in contrast to the non-primary antagonist, Melos, who spends this episode mostly just lurking in the shadows and preparing to take over in the finale. We'll get to him more after we talk about what's up at Hexside though, as the rest of the episode, at least around the kids, takes place here, and besides besides just giving us one final episode at such a prominent location in the show, it also gives us a chance to catch back up with a lot of the side characters that really don't get a ton of focus in the season otherwise, with the two standouts being AmpleSamuel and Basha, the latter of which has taken over as the leader of the school. Basha trying to stay attached to her old life by not allowing the school to fight against the Collector serves as a nice mini storyline for her, although it obviously mostly reflects on Amity, which comes to fruition in their scene together later. First up though, having the gang get to the Collector by using the glyph from Hollow Mind is a really neat plot element, and having AmpleSamuel serve as a mole against Basha is a really nice way to use him in the story. Before getting to the big 3 character development moments at the end of this episode, we have to first leave behind the kids and go back up to the Collector and King, where we also get to see what Odalia's up to. Seeing Odalia suck up to the Collector makes a ton of sense for her character, and seeing her used like a maid is quite cathartic for the viewer. The visuals up in the archive house are immaculate and creating such a different vibe from anything else in the show, and the Collector's room being a mini planet is such a cool idea that creates such a cool space, and also allows for some fun gravity gags, such as the book, which ends up being a warning of the Collector's power, putting even more pressure on King. Speaking of King, we also get to see that he's been protecting a non-puppet Ida and Lilith, who despite not really doing anything in this episode, continue to have that sister chemistry that they developed towards the end of the last season, and just seeing them for a little bit before the finale is nice, although their arcs are largely finished, so it's nice to see most of this final season spent on the kids. One last thing before getting back to them though, let's talk about Melos, who has some of my favorite scenes of the episode, as he's tormented by visions of past Golden Guards as he falls apart while looking for a new body. Every scene with him is perfectly creepy, with Caleb just glaring into his soul, and it's surprising how gory some of these scenes are allowed to be. Seriously, we get to watch a Grimwalker, which is essentially a human, have its flesh dissolve to the bone as Melos takes over, and it's seriously metal. Watching him just skip right past Odalia to take over Rain is a funny scene in itself, and while the fact that it's Rain's body that he uses to try and convince the Collector that King is planning his assassination doesn't really matter for this episode, it sets up one of the best scenes in the finale that we'll get to in a little bit. Anyway, enough talking about everybody else, let's get back to the fight against Basha's assistant, who, gasp, ends up being Kikimora. This fight is really fun and showing both how well Luce and Amity can fight at this point, as well as giving Camilla a really fun sequence where she chucks her baseball bat at Kikimora. This fight ends with the group being split into 3, with Amity and AmpleSamuel being the first to get their moment. Obviously, the focus is on Amity here, and while watching her confront her old life and choose to stay with Luce and her friends instead of going with Basha is obviously not a tense moment, as in which option she's going to choose, it does a good job in showing just how much she has changed from the character that we met back in season 1. Next up is Hunter, Gus, and Willow, and man do I love this scene so much. Besides just being really well animated and showing how the plants grow to terrorize all 3 characters, as well as also just being a cool concept in itself, the writing in this scene is just immaculate. After her gift to Hunter ends up just making him feel even worse about what happened to Flapjack, Willow's confidence as the emotional leader of the group dwindles, and seeing that shown in a physical representation of what she believes to be happening, as in her help just making things worse, is a really cool scene. The little monologue that she goes on is heartbreaking, as all of the confidence that she's built up in the last 41 episodes or so just seems to go away. Of course, this ends with the reveal that Hunter got the powers he had with Flapjack when Flapjack healed him, which besides just giving Hunter a way to fight which he kind of needed, also showcases the fact that what Flapjack represented is still alive in Hunter, which is what he has been worried about throughout the entire episode. The conversation between him and Willow where they reassure each other that they don't suck is fantastic, and watching her sob about missing her family feels like the pressure within her from the entire episode being released at once. Finally, the last big character moment of the episode is between Luce and her mother, which feels like it finally releases the tension within their relationship, as the true reason behind Camille's actions, as revealed in her dream sequence, are revealed to Luce here. It's yet another really well-written scene with fantastic animation, as many of the core themes from the series, such as understanding, are touched upon here as Luce's arc from the entire show comes to its climax. It's a demonstration of how far she's come since being afraid of her mother's opinion back at Grom, and it's physically represented with the hatching of the talisman, which is something else that the series has been building up to for quite a long time, and it nails it, both in what it ends up being, a snake shifter, which is a nice representative of Luce's character, and of course in the animation, which truly paints the scene as being this big epic moment for the series. Anyway, before getting to the end of the episode, watching all of the kids pile on Kikimora does a good job in wrapping up whatever arc Basha had, and it establishes that Hexside isn't going to be run like a Lord of the Flies situation anymore. The choreography during the second fight and the following glyph drawing is really impressive too, as the episode takes full use of the fact that Luce has a staff now. Finally, the scene at the very end does a good job in giving us a chill moment before the finale, letting both couples interact, and just giving us a breather in general before the collector announces a new game and the credits roll. Overall, while it's a bit hard to judge this episode without talking about the finale, I will say that it's filled with great scene after great scene, and truly feels like it's fitting in a season's worth of development in 44 minutes in the best way possible. The stuff with Hunter and Willow is especially impressive, definitely being my favorite storyline of the episode, and I really can't think of anything to criticize. Fantastic penultimate episode to the series, as it nails the tall task of being the awkward middle part of a trilogy.
King?
No, but he does get his good looks from me.
Don't worry guys, I know this video is getting kind of long, but I'm sure that this review will be nice and short. Watching and Dreaming starts with this fantastic tone setter that wastes 0 seconds of the episode's 55-minute runtime, as everybody is captured and we see the first glimpse of the Titan, both of which showcase how quickly the chill situation from the last episode has turned into chaos. All of this leads to the title card of the episode, set against Luce sitting in the Emperor's chair, which is one of the best shots of the entire series, and we're less than a minute in. The entirety of Luce's dream is genuinely terrific, and getting to see the castle one last time, just like the first season finale, all while Luce is draped in the Emperor's clothes, just makes for a super memorable and impactful scene. And that's before even getting to Luce talking to her friends, which is just so ridiculously well written and horrifying as they dig into her insecurities, while the show gives us some terrific choreography and beautiful backgrounds, and before we're even 2 minutes into the finale, it's already off to a great start. Amity's fight against Luce, mirroring the Clawthorn's fight at the end of the first season, is a really fun twist. The location of Willow's is some great atmospheric horror, Gus's fits his character as it's more of a performance, and the writing during all three works so well because everything they say is technically true, and Luce knows it. But my favorite of the 4 takedown sessions for Luce has to be Hunter's. Remember when I said like a minute ago that the title card was one of the best shots in the series? Well, it might not even be the best shot of the episode, as Hunter staring at the statue of Flapjack, Evangelion style, is even better, and is likely the desktop background of many computers this week. The voice direction is fantastic, as Zeno Robinson perhaps gives the performance of the season and blaming Luce for Flapjack's death, and Luce figuring out that her friends are puppets is a creative scene too, and the following sequence has some creative visuals and is a pretty clever way to end the dream sequence. Speaking of which, she isn't the only one to get tortured by this kind of sequence, as King and Ida are subject to the same thing. Both of them are equally as creative and equally as well written as Luce's, albeit likely even harsher, with Ida being confronted with her father actively bleeding, and King being confronted with what he believes are the bones of his siblings. This of course leads to the reunion scene between the main 3 characters of the show that the series has been leading to all season, and it's everything that you could have hoped for. It's a little bit short, but it's sweet, and that's really everything it ever needed to be. Similarly in quality, I love the early showing of Melos' plan at the beginning of the episode, and watching him and Rain fight over control of the latter's body results in this gruesomely great scene. The collector playing with Luce, King, and Ida definitely has some nice animation, but out of every scene in this finale, it perhaps feels the least useful, especially given that after the first Pac-Man bit, it's pretty obvious what the result's gonna be. But hey, in a 55-minute spectacular, a somewhat tedious 2 minutes with cool animation is forgotten rather quickly, as Luce talking to the collector begins to weave together the series-long theme of wanting to be understood with the collector's struggle. And besides making his eventual redemption obvious, it also gives the show a chance to reminisce about the relationship between the main trio, which was kind of needed given their separation during most of the season. While this is initially accomplished through some impressive impressive dialogue as they compare their friendship to those that the Collector is forcing, the tour around the Boiling Isles, besides just giving us some nice nostalgia as we look at some of the most iconic locations of the show for the last time, also further illustrates how far the main trio have come since their feuds that populated the first dozen episodes or so. We also get to see some actual character development for the Collector here, which is something that we haven't really gotten yet, and it's actually pretty solid. From the beginning, it was clear that the Collector's intentions are obviously not the mass damage he was causing, and this section does a really good job in getting the audience to sympathize with him, which works really well as the show transitions Melos back into the primary antagonist role. Speaking of which, the scene across the bridge and into the castle as Rain tries to prevent him from taking over the Titan is seriously a chilling scene, and the Bard magic is just as creative visually as it was back in Ida's Requiem. The scene might honestly be my second favorite of the episode, as there aren't any goofs or gaffs, it's just genuinely two of the strongest characters in the show battling for control. In a shortened season where there's just not enough time for every side character to have a big moment, I'm glad that Rain got theirs. Anyway, this, of course, sets up the final big bad of the entire series, being Melos powered by the heart of the Titan and turning into this giant Godzilla-like creature. The show does a really good job in illustrating the scale and the power of this beast, as in a matter of seconds, the entire landscape of the Isles is transformed. This shot with the Collector especially just shows how massive this version of Melos is in comparison. Watching the Collector try to apologize only to have it immediately backfire kind of feels like the show trying to make sure it doesn't get the same stigma that other cartoons of this generation have received for being too big on just forgiving everybody. And of course, it leads to the big emotional moment of the episode, Luz sacrificing herself and dying. Despite the fact that the audience already knows that Luz isn't going to end this episode dead, the show still plays it completely straight, as the reactions of both Ida and King feel so realistic and gut-punching, as their rage just completely overtakes them and they both go kind of primal. Watching the balls of light fly across the sky makes for a pretty cool scene too, and just watching it go past the unsuspecting other kids who don't know this their friend is a really neat scene that kind of makes me wonder why we didn't actually get to see them react to Luz's death. Speaking of which, I kind of glanced past Hunter, Amity, Gus, and Willow in this episode, and that's because the show kind of does too. That's really the only issue I have with the finale, is that these five play such a small role. I get that they've been the main characters the last two episodes, and that King and Ida are more than deserving of some screen time, and the mini fight that we do get to see with the glyphs being used to fight debris or something is somewhat entertaining, but the fact that we never get to see Hunter watch Melos be defeated or Amity react to Luz's new form feels underwhelming. Speaking of Luz's new form, after her death, we get resolution of one of the series' longest mysteries, as she has a conversation with the Titan of the Isles, King's father, and the in-between realm. Besides it just being beautifully animated as she falls into the abyss, the introduction of the Titan also adds some comedy back into the episode, as well as a really interesting discussion of motives. Where this scene does do a good job in explaining why forgiving the Collector works and forgiving Melos wouldn't, I am a bit disappointed with how the show handled this conversation, as it depicts Melos as a villain without a good bone in his body, which somewhat eliminates any sense of humanity in the character, but it's almost necessary for what the show plans to do to him later in the episode. The death of the Titan obviously reflects more on Luz than it does on the character we met 5 minutes ago, and Luz having to make the choice to choose herself reinforces her arc that was somewhat wrapped up with the hatching of her talisman, as she finally learns to accept herself as who she is, which of course results in her becoming a temporary Titan Witch hybrid, which is one of the best designs in the entire show. The reveal of this new form is a perfect blend of the grandeur it deserves and the general goofy nature of the show, and it leads to the last action sequence of the entire series. Luz teaming up with King and Ida to wipe out some of the Melos scoop feels like a final fight should, as the animation gets a significant finale bump, and it's it's nice to just see the characters interacting in this kind of way. As I mentioned before, the scene back at the archive house looks nice, but definitely pales in comparison to the fight down at the Titan's heart. If you've thought you've seen an animation bump before, then think again, as the scenes as they look at the boiling isle from space, and as Luce, Rain, Ada, and King tear at the Titan's heart, are both unreal in their presentation as the show becomes genuinely breathtaking. The moment that Luce takes Melos out of the heart is a moment that I'll talk about more at the end of the video, but I want to get to what I think is not only my favorite scene of the episode and my favorite scene of the season, but perhaps my favorite scene in the entire series. Melos trying to deceive Luce one last time was anticipated, but the lack of emotion from Luce as she allows the boiling rain to finish him off instead of giving him the time of day to defeat him makes the scene just so spectacular. Melos lived his entire life by deceiving others, something that was made evident by various character statements throughout this season, and just watching him literally crumble the first time it doesn't work is extremely satisfying. It's also just a really clever scene, as the sound direction makes it feel incredibly cinematic, and seeing Luce tower over Melos is quite cathartic, almost as much as watching Rain, King, and Ida stomp out his last bit of life. I do wish that perhaps Hunter or Lilith, characters who have been more directly harmed by Melos, were present, but hey, this scene is still tremendous. While I wish the Titan had gotten at least a little bit of interaction with his son, the scene with Luce being bewitched is still stunning, and the bread pun is a funny, heartfelt ending to King's daddy issues. And this is where the extra long runtime comes into play, as the episode gets 12 minutes of no conflict animation to show where everybody ended up after the defeat of Melos. Now, I'm not going to go over every single thing, as this video was already quite long, but I'll hit some of my highlights. Watching everybody reunite back at the Owl House is a nice scene that could have used more dialogue instead of narration, and especially at least some Hootie, but every interaction in it, especially Camilla meeting Ida and King, and especially King's goodbye to the Collector, all end up feeling as satisfying as they could. Luce saying goodbye to the glyphs is yet another fantastic scene, as it fully illustrates that she no longer needs to be able to do magic in order to accept herself for who she truly is. Post time skip, everybody's got a new design, and in order to save time, I'll go ahead and tell you that they're all fantastic ways to evolve their respective characters, and that Amity and Gus are definitely the highlights. Luce graduating Earth High School and going to Magic College feels like a good way to mix the two different directions the show could have gone here, almost as if they were cleaved together. Sorry guys, I couldn't go this whole 30-minute video without making a single Star versus joke. Anyway, back to the episode. While I get that some fans will be disappointed in the lack of actually making Hunter and Willow a couple, watching them glide about is perhaps the closest that we were ever gonna get, and it makes for a fun watch. Both of their professions make sense, and both Flapjack's grave and everybody's tattoos are a great way for the show to recognize the big death of the final season, if you don't count the Titan. Seeing the school one last time is fun too, and Amity's introduction as a sky pirate is thoroughly sick. The music during this whole credit scene is fantastic too, and it leads well to what's probably the biggest reveal of the sequence plot-wise, being that Alador has figured out how to remove sigils. It's a quick scene, but in a series so built on the idea of hope, getting rid of a permanent inhibitor of nearly every adult in the show is nice to see. Finally, the last location of the episode is the University of Wild Magic, which is run by Ida, which is a fantastic way to both show her overcoming her dislike of education, as well as serving as an indicator of hope and future adventures after this episode in the Owl House universe. The very final scene of the series is the celebration of Luce's 18th birthday as a quinceañera after she missed her last 3 birthdays rebuilding the Boiling Isles. It's nice to get some of the last jokes of the series to be about the weirdness of the Isles, and the final moments of the episode still serve to celebrate the weirdness of the series, as the main 3 bond over being weirdos, as well as everybody coming together and a last little bit of Lumity for the road. And finally, the last shot of the series is a 4th wall-breaking in-universe goodbye to the light show provided by the Collector, but what is really a goodbye to the fans, and is perhaps the last we'll ever see of the characters that we've been following for years. So yeah, was it a good finale?
Yeah!
Yeah.
Yeah.
Originally, this conclusion was going to serve as a final review for the season, but given how long this video has already become and how unambiguous my thoughts on the quality of it was, I thought I would just give some thoughts on the legacy of the show in general. Honestly, when I first watched The Owl House around when it came out, I was pretty turned off by it. Hearing Luce scream, "Eat this sucker," in the very first episode made me feel like the show was just gonna be a campy, corny mess. But after catching back up with the show last year, I'm not sure if it was me or the show that had changed, likely a little bit of both, but I was genuinely infatuated with it as I caught up on all 40 episodes in about 2 weeks. And as I heard Luce belt the same line that I had disliked so much in that first episode as she tore Melos from the heart of the Titan, all I could feel was reverence for how the show handled its cast in such a delicate way in order to weave such an impactful story, and how that corniness that I was turned off by in the first episode ended up being one of the show's biggest strengths, as it's the epitome of the show's theme of staying true to yourself. I'm not gonna go over every single character arc in the series, I pretty much did that in my video about the last 2 seasons, but I do want to give a little bit of focus on Luce for a moment. Until I watched the finale a little bit less than a week ago, I really don't think that she would have cracked my favorite characters list in any shape or form, but after watching the finale, I have a new level of appreciation for her as a protagonist and what she represents. The hope that Luce has throughout the entire series is depleted right at the beginning of this season, but the slow rebuilding of it until it explodes in the final episode, as the weird girl from season 1 finally gets to become the witch she's always dreamed of, only to find out that she still has that feeling even after her Titan magic runs out, makes for such a great finish for such a great character. After seeing the end of Luce's journey, it makes me appreciate each step of it that we watched throughout the series so much more, and thus my appreciation for the Owl House in general grows so much more. Luce Noseda fits the Owl House as well as any protagonist fits their series, and the finale's focus on her is partially what makes it so genuinely impactful. Watching her lose everything just to come back even stronger is such a delight to see, and ultimately made her one of my favorite protagonists in media. But of course, she's not the only character that's fantastic, as it's honestly rare for a character to be mediocre in this show than terrific, and for a show as character focused as the Owl House, having memorable and diverse characters was a must, and it more than exceeds that quota. Throughout all 43 episodes, the Owl House was a well-written, smart, emotionally dense, thematic masterpiece that I was really glad to watch develop into a better and better show, and I hope that I've done an okay job covering it with these 2 videos. Its themes of found family, accepting who you are, and sticking together will stay with me forever, and for that, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank the cast and crew for delivering such a terrific show. While I hope that this isn't the last time I'll talk about this series on this channel, this video is already like my longest script in 8 months, so I'll end it here. If you want to see what I'm working on next, you can check out my Twitter, but otherwise, that's it for me. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I hope that you remember that us weirdos have to stick together. Thanks for watching.